Hello.
Kia ora tato, kia ora Ben, kia ora everybody. How's it going?
Good, thanks, Jess. Thank you so much for having me on for another top stream. Who would have known another lockdown was on the way?
Yeah. It's been a while since the last lockdown. It's been a while since the last live stream. Happier about one than the other. Thanks
Yes.
to thanks to everybody. Thanks to everybody who's watching out there in social media land. Um, I'm Jessica Hammond, top Oharia candidate, and this is Ben Peters, Dr. Ben Peters, rather,
Thank you.
Dunedin candidate. And we're really happy to be talking to you tonight about, well, we're happy to be talking to you tonight, not happy that we're having to talk to you under level 4 conditions. But otherwise, clearly, Ben and I both have young kids. We would
Mm,
still be at home. So on a
yes,
Saturday night.
yes. That's,
So,
that's why we
you
scheduled
know.
it for 9 o'clock when mine are asleep. So,
So before we get started, please drop your questions into the comments, and we'll be able to get to some Q and A's. Start a live stream if you like. Feel free to share the stream so we can bring more people on board. It's just so wonderful to have an incredible science communicator like Ben here to
thank you.
answer your questions and to answer my questions and to get us all a bit more informed and to help us have some fun on a Saturday night stuck at home.
Mm.
Yeah. So Ben, tell me, who are you locked down with, and how's it going?
It's going all right. I'm locked down with quite a few. We have a big house, so it's myself, my wife, my two children who are 2 and 5. Fortunately, they've just dropped off to sleep. We managed to keep our 2-year-old from having a nap today, which was really good because then she went to sleep early. But also, I have my mother and father-in-law, and I have an aunt as well. So we have a big family. Don't you just love the housing crisis to help build up intergenerational housing, a whole new way of living? So that's it's an interesting time. There's not quite as much space as we'd love at times, but fortunately the weather's been really good, so we've been able to stay outside and not stomp on each other too much. And yourself, Jess, what's your household like at the moment?
Yep. So I'm here in Wellington with my husband and my two children who are 10 and 12, so slightly more self-sufficient. Yeah. So we're doing okay. We are um, both working as public servants.
Mm,
For us during lockdown, work tends to increase rather than
yep.
decrease. So bit of a challenge, but you know,
Yeah,
we'll get
yeah.
there.
No, we've been. I work at the university, and we've had to shift everything online very quickly. And being one of the more technologically savvy individuals in the team has been. It's a fairly big workload trying to get everything online and up and running, especially for some of our larger papers, which have up to about 1,500 students. So it's been a challenge. I think yeah, I went to bed most nights around midnight and then checked my emails first thing in the morning again afterwards. So it's definitely long. So if I do start stumbling, it's probably a sign I need to sleep more.
Yeah. So shout out to everybody who's doing it hard in lockdown, especially those of you who have been at places of interest, and those of you who are worried, and those of you who are trying to combine um, paid work and unpaid work, caring responsibilities, um, the stress and the worry, and yeah,
Mm,
much love to you all.
yeah.
So Ben, why don't you give us a bit of a rundown on why we're in level 4 and how things are going?
Yeah, we're in level 4 because we got cases and we didn't know where they came from. So as soon as that happens, you kind of go, "Oh crap! This we don't know how bad this is. It could be just one transmission. It could be many." And so that's why we got the initial 3-day lockdown. And 3 days was kind of the period where they go, let's figure things out, right? So you can't go shorter because it's kind of pointless. And until you know, there's not a lot of point in going longer because it may turn out to not be needed. And in this case, 3 days was enough to establish that we had the Delta variant, and that does change things an awful lot. And also was enough to establish that there was at least a couple of transmissions between the individual that first got tested and where the case actually came from. So that whole scenario puts us in a place where you go, yeah, let's stomp this out very quickly. We also happen to have a simultaneous example over in Australia. We kind of have a live comparison of what happens if you delay doing lockdowns, if you do softer lockdowns. The answer is that things don't really go well. So that's why we're here, both epidemiologically and also politically. It becomes really, really positive to do a lockdown when you've got such a huge contrast. And now I've heard special requests for your Lego videos, Jessica. And actually, my wife is a massive fan and tried to show our children this morning how to do, like, what it's like when the Delta goes around and infects other people with some little pink blocks, which were Delta kind of jumping on other people. Do you have a way of visualizing just how different Delta is from the regular to what it is now?
I do, and this one goes out to you, Craig, for requesting the Lego. So Delta is different from the original COVID Mark One, because it is more contagious. So it has a higher R number, and the R number is how many people you can expect one person to spread it to. Right?
Yeah,
Is that a
yeah,
good way of explaining it, Ben?
yeah.
So
It
in
does
our
change a little bit, but yeah.
Yeah, and the R number, if I understand it correctly, is kind of what it would be if you didn't do any kind of public health measures, or you're not vaccinated and all that sort of
Yeah, so
carry on,
it's
right?
kind of like that. It does take into account that. So it's a measure of it will change depending on what measures you're doing. So if you
Right.
ramp up all your measures and you lock people down, because it's a measure, it's the observed rate, right? So it's not intrinsic to the virus. And so what you're seeing if you have an R value of 5 during a lockdown is that it's still spreading to 5 people while we're locked down. So that would be really, really terrible. If you have an R value of less than 1, then it's not spreading because you're infecting less than one person per thing. So yeah, that's kind of it. It changes a lot based on whatever the current environment is. And so if you have a very infectious environment, the R value go up. If you're doing everything you can to slow it down, it will go down. But yeah, I think the original one was sitting around about a 3. I
Yeah.
think if that, what have you got there pre-prepared?
Okay. So this is our what do you call it? The index case. This
Yep.
is our first person who gets infected with the original COVID, because there's an R value of 3. Assuming we don't have public health measures and vaccination and things like that, she can pass it on to 3 people. Sorry, each one of these little blocks is a person, so that's 3 people high. This is 1 person high, and each of those will pass it on to 3 people. So this is 9 people high. So you can see why we were really worried about original COVID, because I don't have enough Lego to do. Well,
Yeah. I think
maybe I can do the next
I
one, but
think if you do the math, it works out to be about 150 days to infect the whole planet. If it has completely uninterrupted, doubling every about 3 days is what it was roughly doing early on.
right. So this was concerning, but if we want to have a look at our index case for Delta, uh, COVID, they're still working out the R numbers, right? But
Yeah, it's
a
constantly
median
changing.
estimate of the R numbers is 7. So one person gets it, infects 7, and then they each infect 7. So I can't fit this all in the screen, but this person has infected 7. Each of these people have infected 7, and that is your third generation of
Mm,
transmission. I don't know if I can hold this up and hold the other one up at the same time. This is super
see?
precarious, but
Yeah, it's
and
a
I
huge difference.
do not have enough Lego. There's probably not enough Lego in the world to do another um, to do another generation
Mm,
of that. So my understanding, Ben, is that the jury is still a little bit out over whether people get sicker with Delta, but it's definitely way more
yeah.
contagious.
Yeah, we're definitely seeing increased infectivity. It seems like we're seeing a decrease in the time from infection to symptoms, which is actually kind of useful. Part of what made it so hard with the first variant is that there was such a long time from infection to actually knowing that you had the disease, that you are infected, and then getting tested and all of that, that your periods of lockdown had to be really, really long to actually catch a full transmission cycle. As those transmission cycles increase in speed, you can actually catch those variants a lot quicker. So we know now the period at which people would have been infected, and because we have our index case that wasn't that long ago, we'll be able to get that really, really soon. I think we can be in a good place to know if our lockdown is being effective, that we won't have to lock down for that long. If our lockdown turns out to be not as effective, then it will probably be a lot longer. And that will be quite tricky because the longer lockdowns drag on, the harder it is for people to maintain them. So that it's really kind of a tipping point next Tuesday as to what direction we go. I would expect that our cases will go up a little bit, but then hopefully at least plateauing ish by Tuesday. And I think if we're starting to see a plateau, then we can start to get quite relieved, especially with the huge number of tests that we've done. Right, I think we're getting up to like 40,000 or something tests, which is enormous, and gives us really good confidence that we are catching kind of everything. We're able to find everyone that does have that is currently infected. But it also, and I kind of want to make this point because I see a lot of people talk about the PCR test as this kind of thing that chucks up false positives all the time. And so one of those things that I think I always point to is go look at New Zealand, right? New Zealand has done, I think we did 40,000 odd tests yesterday, a record number, and we had 20 positives, right? So we know they're positives because we can then send those on and get their genome sequence, so we know it's not just noise coming in from the PCR test. And that's also part of part of the way we know it is because of the way that we do testing in New Zealand. We don't just test one person, put it in the machine. We do this pooled testing where you'll get put in with 6 other people in your test, and then if one of those 6 gets positive, then you individually retest each one. So each positive gets double tested effectively. So that way you can kind of get confirmation as well. And so any kind of false positives get much, much reduced in that. So I think anyone trying to downplay the significance of COVID based on, these PCR tests are just giving false positives all over the place, I'd say, look at us. We're a perfect example of where it isn't. We've had multiple days in a row, kind of upwards, I think about 100 days in a row of 0 cases, but high testing. And that can only be the case if our PCR testing is actually accurate. So,
And
yeah.
PCR testing is the thing up the nose.
Yeah, it's deeply unpleasant. It's also, yeah.
Cool. And so the testing is giving us a really good picture of how this particular outbreak is spreading, right? And it's reassuring, I think, isn't it, that they are so far all linked. The genome testing is showing that they're linked.
Yeah, it's really good to see that with huge numbers of testing. And we can't ever confirm that every case is linked at this stage because every new case takes time to actually make those connections. But so far, it looks like everything is linked in. Sorry, LinkedIn. I don't mean to associate you with a pandemic. But it is one of those things that it does give you reassurances when you're not seeing different strains come out and you're not seeing kind of clusters come out of the woodwork from that. So that's really, really reassuring so far. And I think we're getting a good picture of kind of the boundary of that outbreak, although that's always expanding a little, as there are always people going out and about a little bit, some for more legitimate things than others. So I think it's a good sign so far, and I think it positions us well if we do stick through this lockdown, that we can hope that it won't be more than a couple of weeks, I think.
This might be a good time to talk about this question of how COVID passes from one person to another, because we've learned a lot about that over the last months, right? About how it's transmitted.
Yeah, so there was definitely early thinking that everything is just droplets, and so droplets are fairly large. The idea is that it's like a genuine bit of spit or something coming out, and there's viral particles in that then needs to land on you, particularly on your mouth or your nose or your eyes or some kind of mucosal membrane, and then that's how you would get infected. What we're seeing more is that it doesn't actually need to be quite so dropleted. It can be more aerosolized. So it's smaller particles are still being a part of that. And what we're seeing is particularly it's airborne as a tricky word to deal with in this situation because it has different meanings in different contexts. But it definitely means that masking up and maintaining distances help diminish that, but it's not enough on its own. And yes, masking does work at reducing transmission. It won't eliminate it, but it does reduce transmission. And there's been some really good studies in America where they have a bit of an issue with which states will and won't. For us, that gives us the opportunity to look at that and see, well, is that working? And they can see in states where there are mask mandates that that does work. We can see in states where they stop people eating indoors, that really helps. So ventilation is a massive part of this. If we can get really good ventilation into these areas, that's huge. And we're seeing it in our MIQ facilities where, two doors being open for even a couple seconds is enough for those particles to start flowing. So we've learned an awful lot, and it's really important that we do take on that information. We realize a mask isn't perfect protection. It's good at reducing the transmission, but there's still a lot more that we can do.
And because now we know that, and my understanding is that droplets are like big, heavy things that big, heavy bits of spit, and airborne is
Yeah,
just like tinier bits that can float
yeah,
further. Is that right?
yeah, yeah.
So we
And
used to, yeah.
oh yeah, yeah. No, you carry on.
So we used to have this idea that if you stayed 2 meters away from someone, a heavy droplet can't go that far, so you're safe.
Yeah.
But we were talking today about Susie Wiles saying, well, there's not really a safe distance anymore because those droplets, those very
Mm,
tiny airborne droplets, can travel much
mm.
further.
Yeah, and so it's more of a continuum than a hard point. And this was something that was quite interesting in the science community where they had this threshold, which was 5 microns. And anything smaller than that was considered an aerosol particle that would float on the air kind of indefinitely and kind of just float out there.
And a
And
micron
anything
is a very, very tiny measurement.
tiny,
So
so
you're
we're
talking
dealing with
about,
micrometers. So a meter about that ish. And then you have a millimeter, which is a thousandth of that. So you kind of familiar with the millimeter. And then from milli, you go to micro. So a thousandth, 1,000th of a millimeter is a micrometer. Yeah, so around 5 of those, which is still very, very, very small, that was used as this threshold. And like, right, anything bigger than that will droplet and fall. Anything smaller than that will stay in the air and float around. And that actually came out of some interesting research in tuberculosis. And what they found in that particular research is that your body effectively has some filtering mechanisms, and so particles that are smaller than 5 microns do tend to go all the way into your lungs, whereas particles that are larger tend to only hit your mouth and nose. That's important for TB, where it kind of needs to get into your lungs to be effective. Totally irrelevant for COVID because it doesn't need to hit deep in your lungs to be a problem. So that's where the 5 micron came out of TB studies. It had nothing to do with actually where the particles would stay in the air or drop because it is just kind of a continuum. And actually, you're around about more 100 microns is where things will actually plummet and not really be infectious at a distance.
oh, wow, much
But
bigger.
we can caveat that and say the further away from someone you are, the less chance that you will actually get things coming into you, partly because you have dilution. So every time you breathe out, if someone's right in your face, you feel that hot air, right? It's not nice. Um, and there's an awful lot of, if they were infectious, that's a lot of viral particles. The further you are, the more that will balloon outwards, and so the less dense the viral particles will be in that, and so the less of it that you'll be getting if you do breathe it in. And again, masking helps with that as well because it will pick up some. It won't perfectly filter, but it will pick up some. And again, reduce that viral load. The more you reduce that viral load on infection, the less severe, usually the less severe. And there's a lot of research going into how much viral load actually predicts how severe your COVID symptoms are. But there is some evidence at the moment that does look like they correlate.
But those people who I saw out today having their
Mm.
little chats 2 meters apart don't think that that's,
No,
that
no, that's not going to be
that's not a
enough.
great idea right now.
No, to go a couple more meters or just pull up a phone. We go for a walk in the evenings with my kids. Today we went out in dressing gowns because they wanted to. And so we masked up and went for a walk around. The kids lasted most of the time with their masks on, which I thought was really good. And yeah, and when you see someone bubble up and give them space and try and make that time spent near each other at a minimum. And outdoors is way better than indoors as well. Again, you have more air flowing, you have, a massive dilution effect that happens really quickly. So, and during the day, you'll also have, sunlight will diminish that.
I've got a
Cool.
couple of questions coming through, if you don't mind me
Yeah.
interrupting you.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely.
That some of them are quite relevant. One person is asking, they've heard that you can catch COVID from toilets flushing. I think it makes
Yeah.
particles splosh around the place.
Yeah. I have not seen that research, but it sounds entirely plausible, and I can tell you why. Over the lifetime of an infection, and there's part of why wastewater testing works, viral particles tend to go through you, and so you end up secreting them, and that's why wastewater testing works. And so you shed the virus. Early on, there was talk of using swabs in that region to get a more accurate test because it kind of does concentrate down as all of the
Well,
mucus and
that
everything
would
like
be
that you're
awkward
swallowing.
in a car.
It would be awkward in a lot of settings. And I think there were reports of some countries using that in an unequitable way to discriminate against certain people and people groups. So yeah, it's not always fun and games. But regardless, moving on from that, it does make sense then that infectious people, if they were using the toilets, we know that when you flush a toilet, you do get a large amount of volatilization. I think this is the reason why in America they have toilets with a high water level, because it does less of that bloomf, because effectively you have the high bowl and it all just sucks down and then refills rather than do that. Or as the person's just suggesting, flush with your lids down. The next thing, so wash your hands, use hand sanitizer, and put the lid down before flushing. Is probably a good thing to do. So yes, it does make sense that it could happen, and so I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Um, I wonder, could we talk about vaccines for a bit?
Yeah, 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 absolutely.
So we've had a few questions about vaccines. One person's asking about vaccines for children, what you think about that. We've just had vaccines available for children aged 12 to 16.
Mm, mm,
Is there any reason we've gone that low? Any reason we couldn't go
yeah.
younger? And then another question is, do you think that once everyone is vaccinated, we can open up? How do
Yeah,
you see that
we'll,
working?
we'll tackle the first one because that's a little easier to start with. And this really just comes down to data coming in, right? So, uh, presumably, small humans are not that different from large humans, but it is very difficult to gain consent from them to do medical experiments. This is why there's actually very little medicine that is directly tested on children. Instead, they usually use adult medicine at lower doses, and that's has its own ethical issues, and that you're not putting medicines through the same process that you do for adults. And that also comes up actually often with things like pregnant people, where you will have a difficulty in knowing whether medicine's safe for them because we can't really ethically test it. And so you end up saying, just be safe and avoid it. With the case of children here, we're going down to, I think, 12, as you said. That's because we are getting data coming through, particularly overseas, showing that it is safe for those age bands. And I would fully expect it to be safe, right? We do most of our immunizations at a young age. I've put through most of my children, or all of my children, through most of their vaccinations. And it's not a pleasant experience. I hold them every time because my wife can't. And so I get that it can be quite like, particularly rabies vaccines are horrible because you have to do them 3 times at about a 2 week interval. And so when we were going over to China, we did a little bit of work over there. We did that for our son because we thought there's a high chance he's going to pat a dog, and there's a moderate to low chance that it is got rabies. So yeah, like it is a difficult thing to do. But I think given the data we're seeing around how, especially the Delta variant, is transmitting, it is transmitting among younger people. And I did see some interesting research go on saying that yes, the approach of going oldest to youngest makes a lot of sense to protect people from serious infection, but jumping a middle band and hitting young people, so kind of mid 20s and under, can be really, really sensible because they tend to be the most active. They tend to go meet with lots of friends. They go to big parties. They are viral vectors. As a person who works at university and catches the fresher flu every single year,
Excuse me.
it just gets around. And so there's some really good thinking about, perhaps actually if the government took on a little bit more about not just how do we protect the people that are most vulnerable to it, but how do we reduce transmission the most, then that could come into it. But while we have an elimination strategy and fairly closed borders, it does make sense to continue with the method they've gone, which does bring us to the closed borders, doesn't it? And what we can do. And so, I mean, Top advocated at probably nearly a year ago now, that it would make a lot of sense to have a dedicated managed isolation / quarantine facility, and it would make an awful lot of sense if that wasn't in Auckland. I think we might be parroting that again, given that we now have a probable MIQ leak again, affecting Auckland, and Auckland will probably be in an extended lockdown longer than the rest of New Zealand. So, and given the economic importance of Auckland, like I lived there for 3 years, but I don't consider myself an Aucklander. Um, but yeah, it's one of those things where you go, thinking about that early and doing that early may have made a big impact. Doing it now will still be quite difficult, but I think given what we're seeing with variants, makes a lot of sense. Um, if we get to the point where we have enough people vaccinated, particularly where we've got a lot of our vulnerable groups vaccinated, I think we will be able to open up more. Um, and I think the reason we'll be able to open up more is because we'll also be able to require of people coming to us that they'll have a negative test and they would have been vaccinated, right? So you can actually start having shorter isolation for people who are doubly vaccinated or that have other safe-ish zones. So, I mean, clearly the bubble with Australia hasn't worked terribly well. And opening bubbles while populations are still largely unvaccinated can be quite risky. That gets a lot less risky if we're opening bubbles to other places that are also highly vaccinated. And so I don't think we'll see a complete opening. I think you'll see some kind of stratified, these countries get greenlit, and a lot of that would be based on how well vaccinated those countries are as well as ours, which does bring in things like vaccine passports and things like that. Internationally, very happy for vaccine passports. They already exist. For many countries, you can't actually travel unless you have certain immunizations. So I think Thailand, you have to have a couple, and some other places as well, which I'm not totally up on my travel doctoring. It's not my day profession. But yeah, so those kind of things I think are fine. And ethically, I have zero problem with saying, hey, because anyway, like to move to another country, you need to have a contract with that other country anyway. That's what your passport is. So including in that vaccination status, perfect sense, happy with that. But I wouldn't want to see that domestically, because I do think that is very problematic in how you would police that, and what that would mean for people's freedoms within the country. And so I do think it's a matter of trying to get as good a vaccine program as we can here, and then hopefully we can see the country opening up. Keep in mind that our country, except for the borders, but internally has been really open and free so far, which has been really nice, which I guess is why it's such a shock to have to go into lockdown. It's like, it was so nice not having to, and kind of pretending that COVID was some other foreign thing, not close to home for us.
Um, and what's the vaccine passports? So how shall I put this? We know that vaccines are really, really good at stopping you getting a very severe case so that you're going to end up in hospital.
Yep.
So that's great, and that's great both on a personal level, but also on stopping hospitals getting overloaded, both for the good of the hospitals, but also so that the people who get sick with other things, there is somewhere for them to
Yeah.
go. But what's the current thinking on how vaccines help you to not pass on to people who are
Mm,
unvaccinated, perhaps?
mm. Yeah, so this is where it doesn't look as good. So it is, the evidence is coming out now, particularly with the Delta variant, that it looks like you can still have a decent viral load while vaccinated. And on that, I think viral load is measured, if depends on what they're doing. If they're doing PCR tests, then they can measure the quantity of RNA. I saw that was one of the questions that came up, so I thought I'd address that just to get a two for one in. So you can either measure the quantity of kind of RNA or the kind of the number of genomes that are there, which will relate to the number of viruses, or you can do a serum test where you actually take a blood sample and then kind of count the number of viral particles within it. So yeah, two ways there. So what it looks like, it is having some impact on reducing the spread because you're going to have less people sick, you're going to have less people getting infected, but there is still the possibility that some of those people who are vaccinated can be. And I think we can point to the wife of our first case who was fully vaccinated and then did not get or did not get infected at all. And so that's a strong indicator that for some people they will avoid infection completely, or at least in a detectable way. So it'll be a tiny, tiny amount will get in, and the immune system will just overwhelm that immediately. So it definitely reduces transmission, but in some people they will still be asymptomatic. And we're also seeing people um, who have been vaccinated, often they recover quicker. So it shortens the length of time that they can infect people. And that's really good as well because it means you're going to bump into less people, you have fewer close contacts. So that's another good reason why the vaccinations can help in that setting.
So it's sounding like vaccination makes you less likely to contract it,
Mm,
have a less severe case for a shorter time,
yeah,
and maybe even if you do get it, less likely to pass it on.
yeah,
Okay.
yeah, yeah. I think that's the overall picture that's being painted. The exact numbers in there, tricky to do. I did see some things in like coming out of Israel because Israel has a very high vaccination percentage. Things like serious hospitalizations were down 16-fold from when they were unvaccinated, and deaths were also down a huge amount, I think tenfold or something like that. So you're getting a huge reduction in the severe disease burden, and that's huge for a country. Part of the reason we've done lockdowns as our initial strategy is because we were advised, hey, your health system, not that hot. We were rated really lowly for preparedness. And so we went, this is bad. This is really bad because only a few cases would be enough to overwhelm us. And so that's why we went to a very hard and fast strategy. And that's kind of shaped what we've done following that. But it's still very true that it won't take much to overwhelm our health system. And that has really wide-ranging effects. I know a lot of people focus on death, right? Like it only kills a small proportion of people, but a it's still a lot of people. I think we should avoid those deaths. But B, having a lot of people sick at the same time does terrible things to your country, right? If your supply chains get interrupted because you don't have enough healthy drivers, or if too many farmers are down with illnesses, and then that's an entire season of crops that don't get harvested. So it can have really long lasting and impacting effects if too much of your country gets sick at the same time. If your hospital systems get overwhelmed, you cure all the treatable diseases that we currently have going around as well. So that will exacerbate those deaths and those illnesses. So it's so much more than just deaths going around that's so important. And I think I see a lot of talk around, we just need to, the best immunity is a natural immunity. Just let the virus move around. I don't want your experimental vaccine. And I would say to that it is a much bigger and more dangerous experiment to let something like the virus spread in an uncontrolled way, rather than things like a vaccine which has been tested now on hundreds of thousands and rolled out to millions of people worldwide, and we're not seeing those side effects that people are so worried about. So the vaccine is showing that it is enormously safe and is very way 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 better than having the virus itself. And if you're worried about things like, well, it'll make the spike protein, and we know that the spike protein does bad things, guess what? The virus is full of the spike protein and isn't as localized as the vaccine and will make you sicker. And so all of your fears about what the spike protein may do is true if you get COVID. And so I think it's just that logical issue of trying to hold one up and not the other in that setting.
Mm. Keep the questions coming through. I'm afraid if I've missed your question, I can't see it anymore. So if
Oh,
I've
yeah, it's not scrolling, is it?
yeah, so feel free to post a question again if it's a burning one. I'm possibly not thinking about answering some of the questions
I did
about.
see Ivermectin pop up, and I'm happy to address that one.
Okay, go
Because
on. That was one of the ones I don't know what that is, and I don't know how to pronounce it.
yeah,
So
so
can you have to
Ivermectin
put
is
that up again if you want me to say it?
Ivermectin is my personal medicine that I hate. But so there's a couple things going on here. Number one, we have people wanting a cure, right? It happens with anything, any sickness out there. People will promise you a fast cure that someone is suppressing and isn't letting get out there. In the measles outbreak in Samoa, we saw it with alkanated water. So water that was slightly basic doesn't do anything, ends up killing children if
It's
they take
basic.
that instead of getting proper treatment, right? And so I get quite passionate about people selling things that aren't right and aren't actually going to do something. Don't talk to me about acupuncture. And ivermectin is a classic case of this.
We're gonna get messages, Ben. We're gonna
I
get
will. I
messages.
will. I'm happy to take those messages. Send them to my Facebook page. So
Okay.
with ivermectin, there was some hope early on that it might do something, right? It's an antiparasitic, and so it's used to treat things like river blindness, I think, in tropical areas. And pretty much every time a new pandemic or a new disease emerges, people go, "Oh, what about ivermectin?" And they'll try it in the lab, and they'll go, "Oh, this is promising. It's doing things in the lab." And you try and take it into the real world, and it falls over. It falls over pretty much every time, and it just is not effective at viruses. Now, that doesn't mean that people haven't tried to make it effective. And so there are lots of studies out there that have looked at this. Lots of places have invested money into studying um, this particular treatment, and it hasn't shown up with great results. And I know that there are websites out there that say, ivermectin meta study, etc., etc. One of the biggest studies done turned out to be completely fabricated, and that's a really problematic because people were too keen to show that it worked that they weren't willing to just do the science and show that. Instead, they had a fabricated study. It was a study by some Egyptian authors, last name Al Gaza. That may ring a bell if you've been tracking that story, but that has since been retracted. They had things in there like enrolling patients that had already died. So that's tricky. You can't treat people that are already dead, and having patients that never existed and things like that. So it was a genuine fabrication. And it was one of the only studies in most of the meta studies that was highly significant. And so that was giving credence to the meta studies. And when you remove that, it was no longer significant in many cases. And so it's one of those things that people love to latch onto. And the reason I want to address it is that poison centers in America particularly, but I wouldn't be surprised if it happens a little bit in New Zealand, have been getting many calls from people accidentally poisoning themselves with ivermectin. So it's constantly touted as being very safe and effective, right? Because it has been used in other illnesses. The thing is that it is safe relative to river blindness. And the reason I say that is because any medicine is measured not against what if it's nothing at all, but compared to the illness, right? With the exception of vaccines, we'll get back to that in a moment. Something like ivermectin, you really want something that is effective against river blindness, and so a little bit of side effects is not too bad. I think about 1% of people get diarrhea from it. That's okay on its own, but people weren't able to get it just from pharmacies, and so then they were buying it from farm stores, and they were getting ivermectin doses that were suitable for horses and cows, and then taking that. So that's really bad. So please, please, please do not buy medicine from a farm store or from a vet and try and take it yourself. The idea that that is somehow safer than the vaccine that has been trialed on people, and it is far less effective than the vaccine, which is very effective. Yeah, it blows my mind, but people keep going back to it. And so I want to reiterate again, it's not suppressed by the government. It's just not that effective. And we have very effective vaccines on hand. And so that is why you're not seeing people going, oh, yeah, no, we're going to keep putting money into studying this. It's just not that effective. And I was going to say with the vaccine point that vaccines are compared to if there was nothing, right? So yes, the vaccines are far, far, far safer than COVID. And in this instance, the likelihood that you get COVID is actually kind of high. For most vaccines, you compare that to a baseline of nothing because the people aren't sick at the time. So vaccines have some of the highest safety profiles of any medicines that you can find.
All right. Is there anyone who over the age of 12 shouldn't get the vaccine?
Consult your doctor. I'm not giving medical advice. Yeah,
Sorry,
especially in
not anyone
biochemistry,
specific.
not
Yeah.
medicine. So yeah, definitely talk to your doctor if for whatever reason you have concerns around particular health issues and what that might have. I'm not aware of any off the top of my head, but there will be some cases for people.
I would say, would it be right to say that generally, there is, with childhood vaccinations and things, that there are some people, would say if you have cancer or something, there are some people who vaccinations, we have to look after them with herd immunity,
Oh,
right? Because they
yeah,
can't
yeah,
get
yeah,
them.
yeah. So there are definitely people with autoimmune disorders or effectively non-functioning immune systems. A lot of people will be on immune suppressants. So if they have an overactive immune system, they'll be on immune suppressants to try and stop that from hurting themselves. But that does make them more susceptible then to sicknesses, and it will mean that things like vaccines don't work as well. So for those people, they do rely more on herd immunity. And like previously, I'd said that things like anti-vaxxers I don't worry too much about because as long as it's a small number of people, then overall it doesn't matter, right? So if there's a small group of people that just hate the idea, that's okay if it's small enough because the rest of us can kind of cover you. You go, all right, you have that view, enough of us do. But when that number starts to creep up and get too high, it starts to teeter and become less effective, especially as we're seeing that the new vaccines are not as effective with some of these variants. So I think with the Delta variant, that number is dropping. It was, I think, like 95% effective with the initial strain. Now with Delta, it's lower, and it seems like that immunity is waning faster with the other variants compared to with the original as well. So those things are a little bit concerning, but hopefully we will have a high enough rate.
And presumably those scientists who, worked their butts off to get us the vaccine in the first place are working
Mm.
on trying to improve them against the new
Oh yeah,
strains.
yeah, and
It's
actually,
like an
this is one of
arms
the things that
race.
is amazing about mRNA vaccines or RNA vaccines is that you can update them like that. Like it's so quick. You can go right. We've got the new spike protein. Here's our new optimized sequence against that, and then we can pump it out. And it does need to go through some of that safety updates, but a lot of that safety update you would have already done a lot of the legwork on, right? So you know the overall the composition, the lipid packaging that it's in. So it's kind of the RNA gets packaged up in this fat ball effectively. Um, all of that stuff is kind of pre-approved then because you've already got that, and so you can get these effectively variant specific boosters. I think will be coming out quite soon, which will be
And
yeah.
and that's is that a little similar to what happens with the flu vaccine, that you need to get boosters because it keeps
Yeah,
changing?
yeah, the flu is way worse than COVID in terms of the rate at which it changes, right? I need a big asterisk there.
Yeah.
COVID is worse than the
Sorry,
flu, but
boosters was the wrong word, wasn't it? Because it's
uh,
entirely new.
kind of, yeah. It changes. It can recombine with itself. It does that
Yeah.
often. And with the flu, because it's so seasonal, we look at the other half of the earth and go, what's happening there? And then as that comes in, we make up our vaccine of the strands that we think are over there. That'll then hit us, and then we update that in real time. It's a really fascinating modern medical marvel that we're able to actually tackle the flu like that. Unfortunately, it's much more difficult to make effective antivirals. So once you're infected, having a medicine for that is a lot more difficult. But there is work going on that with it also with COVID, which is promising.
Cool. We've had a question about that. You said the PCR testing. We're getting the fairly uncomfortable procedure up the nose. Why aren't we doing saliva testing?
Good question. So my understanding of the saliva testing is that there is a possibility that it is slightly less sensitive. So if you don't have active cases and you just want to sample a wide range of people, kind of surveillance testing, saliva testing, I think would be an excellent idea, and I think that the government could and should do that. Uh, in our current situation with our current outbreak, I think we absolutely want all of those close contacts to be receiving the PCR up the nose swab. because it gives you the best chance of detecting it, and especially because people will be turning up quite recently after a possible exposure, so they might be quite early in their infectious cycle, so they won't potentially have much virus already to detect. So I think the up the nose swab, and yes, it's uncomfortable. I've had it a couple times myself. That gives you the best chance of detecting it. And right now, we want to know everyone, not just vaguely, is it around?
Um, okay, cool. Um, someone has asked, could we expect up to 2 weeks at level 3 after finishing level 4? What's your prediction?
Oh, yeah. I mean, my predictions so far have been on point. I predicted the 3 day lockdown. I predicted about a 7 day extension, although I mean, like, technically it's a total of 7 days. Yeah, I think we will definitely go back through slowly. Um, I think and this is, I don't want to say it's more political than epidemiological, but it is so much worse for the government if we move down too quickly and then it gets out of hand compared to people being a little bit pissed off at being at a higher level for longer. And so I think we're going to see the government move very cautiously down levels, just because it's so bad if we have to bounce in and out. And so they will be much more likely to just actually hold the line, keep us at level 4 for longer, depending on what over the weekend looks like. But if we are moving down from level 4, I do expect things like level 3s for the rest of the country. And then maybe once Auckland is sorted out, we might see kind of that shifting down. So it's a little bit dependent on. And sorry, Scott Wild, it will not be level 3 at 2 for the South Island on Wednesday. I think there is almost zero chance of a level 2 by Wednesday down here. I mean, it is possible. About that, but I really don't think it is going to be the case. And I've just seen another one come up about the ivermectin prophylactically. The reason I don't think ivermectin is good prophylactically is because I think you will have a terrible time trying to get an entire population of people to take a pill every day or every week. I just don't think that will have wide uptake, especially when you start looking at what the baseline side effects are. And so, like, like I said, you have about 1% of people will get diarrhea. I don't think people will put up with that when you have something like a one-off vaccine shot. I don't think people will put up with the nausea, the inability to operate heavy machinery. I mean, they say it's safe, and it is compared to river blindness, but you can look up on MedSafe what ivermectin has as its side effects. It's all written, it's all open and able to view. Trying to do that prophylactically, getting someone to take those medicines frequently is going to be very, very challenging, especially at a population level. And then you're hoping that it will be just as effective across all of the variants. There's not really any good information coming out about that. So I do appreciate that you're looking into all the stuff around, but with ivermectin, I think it is a massively overhyped thing, and the actual logistics of trying to keep people on some kind of medicine regime like that. I mean, we have people that are thinking that the vaccine has a microchip and that's controlling us. I think you're going to have a lot more people worried that the government is making you take a pill every day. Like, that to me is just so much more ripe for the conspiratorial thinking, but it is being pushed as a solution. So that's why I'm very unconvinced about it. And we aren't seeing people just suddenly being cured with it. There are some really interesting things that are working well, and I would say, or that are being investigated, and that's something like the convalescent plasma. So you can take antibodies out of someone who has recently been infected but is no longer. They still have antibodies available, and then that can be used sometimes to treat, which is very interesting. We'll get some questions on Israel.
Yeah, we've got a lot. We've got questions coming thick and fast, which is
That's
amazing.
good.
We
We're,
may
we're,
not
we're
get
getting
through all
into
of
the
them.
swing of it. Um,
Someone
uh,
asked a little earlier why apparently there's advice that you should have 2 weeks between having your flu vaccine and your COVID vaccine. Do you know anything
Sorry,
about
could you
that?
say that again? I missed that.
Someone said that there's advice you should have 2 weeks between your flu vaccine and your COVID vaccine.
Yeah.
Do you know about
Um,
that?
I think I remember seeing it, and they said prioritize. I can't remember which one they told you to prioritize. Vaccines can make you a little ill. So part of the reason on that is it's trying to elicit immune response. So I think with your COVID vax, the second one likely hits you a little harder because your body is prepared for it, and so it's actually giving you that reaction to what you've injected, which is good and appropriate for what you want. You don't want to hit that and then also have your flu vax and hit that again. So it's a matter of spacing that out. And I presume also you don't want any potential mixing of stuff coming in together as well. So keeping those well separated by a couple of weeks, which is, we have good evidence that the mRNA vaccines don't stick around long in your bloodstream. So mRNA as a molecule is very unstable. It won't last long in your body. It will last long enough for you to produce some of the protein that it needs to recognize that, and then have your immune system primed. So yeah, I think and I like the mRNA vaccines themselves have been being researched for about 10 years or so, and they've come out of cancer research. So I think, to be honest, if we'd had an application in cancer before now, people would probably be more comfortable with it, because it is new in a very new setting as well. But it is quite promising in the area of cancer where you're trying to prime the body to understand that the cancer is bad. Cancers are very good at evading your own immune system, and they're very good at proliferating. That's kind of the whole reason you have cancer, right? It's your own cells proliferating in an uncontrolled way. So it's growing in an uncontrolled way. If we can prime your immune system to recognize those, then that's really useful. And that's where the RNA vaccines were being thought about. They're going, we need something that is able to be adapted quickly, that we can produce quickly, that we can target to this person. And so we've had about 10 years of that research going through, which is why we can, and the opportunity presented itself for that. And it's also, I think, one of my criticisms of the government, I don't have too many around the whole rollout, but putting all our eggs in the Pfizer basket, for those who are really reluctant about the mRNA vaccine, there are other vaccines, right? We have other vaccines that are actually now approved. I think the Oxford vaccine is the other one that we've approved, and that's a modified virus that's attenuated, so you don't have, so it's replication deficient, so it's completely unable as a virus to replicate, but it does contain or has those little spike proteins on it, and so that will help prime your immune system to COVID, even though, pardon me, it is not COVID itself. And so, like, I personally like the idea of being able to say to anyone who's going, no thanks to the mRNA, to go, sure, here's this one, right? Rather than trying to have another battle around which particular one. I know a lot of people are very much Team Pfizer because it is slightly more effective than the other one, but that's still part of the equation. I think it would be nice, in terms of an overall approach, to get more people on board by going, if you're worried about mRNA, that's fine. We've got other options. Here you go.
But just to be clear, you're not worried about mRNA.
No,
mRNA
no, I think it's
vaccines.
fantastic technology.
Yeah.
And I haven't been able to queue for my vaccine yet. I'm only 30, so I have to wait a while. But I'll get there. My father-in-law, who lives in our house, is, and so we're sending him shopping, because he's more likely to be, less likely to get ill from it. Mm.
Okay. So there's some advice that we'll all need a third Delta shot. I can't see the rest of that question, but I think it said, why haven't we ordered them? We might have to ask the government.
Yeah. So on the government's ordering of vaccines, it all gets tricky, and part of it is I don't have the full information to make good comments on it. So I really like. Yes, it's for me. It's tricky. It's tricky because the reason we have variants is because COVID has gone unchecked in other countries, right? There is no New Zealand variant, right? That's just, we haven't. I mean, we've got some strains, but not variants of concern coming out of New Zealand. They're coming out of places which, and all the variants I think currently that are of concern happened during a time when there wasn't high vaccination rates, and so it's because we have a huge amount of replication of the virus globally that you have the opportunity for the virus to mutate, and then it gets selected once it moves through for the more infectious ones. And so it's frustrating that we in New Zealand are dealing with other countries that have kind of botched up their own responses, and now that's impacting us. And so that's why as a vaccine approach, I'm in two minds, because half of me wants to go, New Zealand shouldn't be vaccinating yet. We should just put all our vaccines over there and try and get them done. Once we've done kind of our border staff and our most vulnerable, just try, the rest of the world needs to sort its stuff out. But at the same time, also, the best way to protect New Zealand in a much more nationalistic sense of like, let's just protect us, is to just vaccinate us and to get those vaccines to us. And so like there's that tension there in me, and it really comes down to like an ethical global versus local dilemma, which is why I haven't really been comfortable commenting on exactly what we should be doing vaccine wise. But I do think, if we're going for the strategy to vaccinate New Zealand, grab a couple of them. Early on, they did that. They then pivoted to Pfizer only, and I got a bit grumpy when Jacinda said, "No, we've always been all of them." It's like, no, you very much went with Pfizer only for a while there. You can't be saying, "Oh no, we're not anymore." And so yeah, I think that is probably. I think I've lost my train of thought about where we were, to be honest.
That's okay. We only have a couple of minutes to go. We've had the biggest shock of the night is that you are 30 and making those of us who are not 30 feel
I have to be honest.
inadequate about our lack
I
of
lied on a
accomplishment.
podcast once and called myself 31. So I apologize if I think Liam here, the conservative commentator, I apologize. That was the only falsehood that I knowingly said that night.
Yeah.
Although if you do want marinade options, I do a Mongolian beef, which is delicious. It's not so much a marinade as a slow cook. It's just equal parts soy sauce, sugar, and water, brown sugar. Slow cook your beef in that. It's beautiful.
Is there
Anyway, sorry.
anything Ben doesn't know? Okay. Well, look, thank you all for being here. We'll see if we can address some more of the questions if we missed any, and I'm sure if you get in touch with us some other way, we can try and help you out if you have any other questions. But there are some really good good and authoritative places where people can go for information, like the Ministry of Health website and the COVID-19 website. Do you have any favourites that are quite accessible, Ben?
No, to be honest, I do an awful lot of Google Scholar reading. That's kind of my
Okay, so
go-to.
don't use Ben's resources. I
Um,
really like the
it's
Science Versus podcast, which I think
yeah, yeah. I
you
had
would
listened
agree
to
is a
that.
really good one.
That was really
Um,
informative. Yeah, I like keeping up with what's going on. Yeah, it's tricky to keep abreast of all of it. To be honest, science Twitter is actually pretty good if you follow some good scientists on there. There's a lot of really good science communicators. So yeah, that's definitely an area that I find. But obviously, got to find the right people on Twitter because it's an open social media platform. But there's a ton of scientists on Twitter that you can dig out and find. I don't have it off the top of my head. Sorry. Susie Wiles obviously is on Twitter and posts there a lot, so you can start there.
yeah. We haven't had time to get to the economic response, but Shai did a
No,
fantastic piece about that recently, which we could probably put in the comments
yeah,
pane, I guess.
I would say like
Um,
bottom line, we want to give money to people and skip the business step, and I think that's
yeah,
about as much as we can go there on that. Yeah, it's been, and I guess we could point to America where um, in America they over halved the child poverty rate. So they had more than halving of that, which is fantastic. When they gave out their stimulus checks, and we saw the poverty rate was nearly halved in that one-off cash payment directly to citizens, not contingent on work, not contingent on anything else. I think it went to about 97% of their citizens, and only the richest 7% missed out. Which, oh no, shed a tear for those. And yeah, and so it was genuinely incredible in what it did economically. And I think, given the disparities we've had in New Zealand with the way that has been rolled out, I'm very supportive of TOP's position to do that.
great.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you so much, Ben, and thank you all of you for your questions, and thank you for watching. Yeah, it's been really nice to see you all again, and really nice to be live again.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, stay safe, everybody. Ka kite.
Cool. Yeah. Ka kite.